Okay. Why don't we get going? It's time to start. I want to welcome everyone to our last History Matters of the spring 2023. We will resume this series again in the fall. I know you're excited too. I want to thank everybody who's helping out with this presentation today, particularly our wonderful audiovisual staff. Thank you so much. And everyone across both campuses, particularly I want to thank my colleagues for coming and Meg, thank you so much for running the Zoom in Hammond. I also want to thank everybody who's come here from far off places, and particularly those I know through the Conference on the History of Women Religious and the History of Women Religion Britain and Ireland listserv. Thank you for attending today. We are going to be recording this session, and at the end of it, we'll be opening up the floor for questions. And so when we do ask questions, particularly here and in Hammond, you're going to need to use a mic to be heard, okay? So, and one more caveat before I begin. A part of this presentation I gave last summer at the Cushwa Center for the triennial meeting of the Conference on the History of Women Religious. And so, hi people who were at that conference, and some of this paper will sound familiar, but I thank you for listening anyway. So my presentation is Bringing Mercy to the World, the Sisters of Mercy's Mission to the United States and Peru. My presentation today is part of a larger research project that will look at two missionary moments for the Sisters of Mercy. The first is what scholars like Sue Ellen Hoy have called a journeying out, when 19th century Catholic women religious migrated from Ireland to places like the United States to provide education, healthcare, and other spiritual and material aid to a growing Catholic and immigrant population in places like Pittsburgh and Chicago, which I'll be talking a little bit about in the first part of my paper. The second occurred over 100 years later when the American Sisters of Mercy journeyed south to provide education, healthcare, and other spiritual material aid to an established Catholic population in places like Sicuani, Peru. At both times, Irish sisters and American sisters were sent as missionaries to sustain and build the church. So in November of 1843, Mother Frances Warde left Ireland from St. Leo's Convent in Carlow and traveled to the U.S. with Sister Mary Joseph Cullen, Sister Mary Elizabeth Strange, and her younger sister and novice, Sister Elosa, Sister Veronica Darby, another novice, Sister Philomena Reed, and Sister Margaret O'Brien, both postulants. Their destination was Pittsburgh, PA, to establish a new Mercy Foundation in that city with Mother Frances as superior. From this foundation grew others throughout the country, many of which Warde planted. She would go on to plant a lot of foundations throughout the country before she ended her life in New Hampshire. From this foundation grew others throughout the country, many as which Warde planted. 3 years after their arrival, Warde led 5 young women to the newly established city of Chicago. The 5 were the former postulant and lay Sister Margaret O'Brien, now Mother Agatha O'Brien, there she is pictured. Novices Vincent McGurr, Gertrude McGuire, and postulants Eliza Corbett and Eva Schmidt. O'Brien, upon making her final profession, was elevated to a choir sister. She was only 24 when they set out for Chicago. In 1961, 4 Sisters of Mercy were selected among the many volunteers to establish a mission to Sicuani, Peru. Sister Nibbard Murphy, Johnetta Caney were both from Chicago. Sister Damaris Twigg was from Baltimore, and Sister Lauren Rogers was from Omaha. They became the foundation of the Mercy's efforts to revitalize life in Sicuani, Peru. They went and took over a hospital, and they established a school. By this point, the Sisters of Mercy had grown foundation after foundation from its first Pittsburgh foundation in 1843, spreading throughout the United States. In 1929, most of the Mercy foundations had joined together in a generalate system, becoming the Sisters of Mercy of the Union. The Chicago province directed the Sicuani mission, but sisters from various provinces within the Union participated. My project began as an outgrowth of my book, Women of Faith, the Chicago Sisters of Mercy and the Evolution of a Religious Community. So this looked at the Chicago province, the Chicago regional community. It encompasses the various Mercy foundations at Davenport and Iowa City, Janesville and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the Chicago West Side, South Side, Ottawa, and Aurora, Illinois foundations. The Sicuani mission was one of many pieces that made up a larger history of the Chicago Mercies. And I had come across the Peru mission, and I wanted to talk about it more, but I didn't have the time to devote that much attention to this study. But I still have some questions about which seem to boil down to how were these missions different? How were the missionaries different? How were they the same? And how did they experience change? Right? How do things change because of this experience? So before we go any further, and probably you're wondering, I've got some terms for those of you. I know some of you in the room know these terms, but for those who don't, I talk about women religious, and it's a technical term for nun or sister. A nun is a cloistered woman religious taking solemn vows for life. A sister is an active apostolic congregation. They take simple vows, which are renewed annually. I mentioned postulants, which are women who are admitted to a religious congregation for normally about a 6-month probationary period. Then the next step in religious life is the novice, still a probationary member of a religious congregation. And after a year, a novice will take their first vows or their simple vows. After that, vows are lifelong promises of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Every religious congregation has a little bit of tweak on that. The Mercies, they were to provide education to women and girls. Even more terms. I mentioned foundations. These are individual foundations of the Mercies congregations that were established. They become independent of one another. When they amalgamated in 29, they developed a generalate system, and they had individual provinces. So the generalate system is the larger organization that spread across the United States. Not all Mercy foundations joined the union at that time, but eventually they would become that. A regional community is another term for province. And when the Mercies became the Institute, they developed regional communities. And one last thing, I mentioned lay and choir sisters. Lay sisters entered a religious life without a dowry, money, or property, and sometimes with an inadequate education. They were the domestic servants of the community often, and they didn't have a voice. They weren't allowed to vote in chapters. Choir sisters, they entered religious life with a dowry, and they often had a better education, and they were sort of ranked that way. The Sisters of Mercy did away with this distinction, did away with having lay sisters in the 1930s, though there weren't a lot of them, even in that anyway in the United States for their community. They're not very popular among US sisters. Okay, let's get going. Let's dive in a little bit deeper. This is not the ship that they came to the United States in. I don't know what it looks like. I think after extensive Googling of ships that were used for migration at this time, it looks very much like it, or at the very least, it's a very cool picture. And I stole this from the internet. Thank you. So when you read the early histories of the Sisters of Mercy's Foundation in Ireland in 1831, and the spread of this congregation throughout Ireland and England, and then beyond to North America, and even far-flung places like Australia, they're full of the glory of God and the romantic language of triumphs and tribulations. We read, no doubt, about the faith and certainty of the sisters setting off to serve God and the Catholic Church, even when these journeys brought heartaches of leaving behind their convent communities. The Mercies who left Ireland to establish foundations followed the Irish diaspora. And if you really want to know more about that, I would read Sophie Cooper's book, Forging Identities in the Irish World. She looks at Melbourne and Chicago in the 19th century to 1922. It's really good. The sisters who left Carlow in 1843 predated a larger exodus of Irish escaping the famine, but only by a few years. So in 1843, Michael O'Connor became the bishop of the newly established Diocese of Pittsburgh. The diocese had only been established about a year, and O'Connor recruited religious congregations like the Mercies to serve a largely immigrant population. He had a connection with the Carlo sisters, and on November 9th, he and 7 Mercies were on board the Queen of the West, a ship bound for New York City, and then they moved on to Pittsburgh by December. The Irish Catholic Church was slowly emerging from centuries of oppression, and congregations like the Sisters of Mercy, founded by Catherine Macaulay, again in 1831, offered vital religious services to Ireland's Catholic population. Not long after the founding in Dublin, Mother Macaulay's congregation established other foundations throughout Ireland and then England. The Carlo community was responsible for sending off 7 sisters to Pittsburgh, also sent them to New Zealand. The flow of mercies to the United States after 1843 continued as the need for more support and religious education of Irish, not to mention the growing Catholic immigrant population. It is easy to lose sight of the uncertainty and danger of the choice that the 7 sisters made when they volunteered for the Pittsburgh Foundation. The same can be said for the 5 sisters who accompanied Warde to Chicago. From a distance of 100 years or even 180, we have a tendency to downplay or overlook the rhetoric used to describe their work and their motivations. According to Sister Kathleen Healy, who wrote a history of the Pittsburgh Foundation in her 1973 biography of Frances Warde, the 6 sisters who accompanied Frances Warde to Pittsburgh were the type of women capable of unusual success in an apostolate to the New World. Josephine Cullen, first cousin of Cardinal Cullen, was a cultured woman and an able administrator. Elizabeth Strange, the first cousin of Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman of England, was highly educated, a witty girl, a fair poet, and a prose writer of style. Aloysia Strange, a novice, was the first Sister of Mercy to make her vows in the United States. Philomena Reed was a well-educated novice of rare promise. Margaret O'Brien, a beginner in the religious life, was destined to be the first superior of the Sisters of Mercy in Chicago in 1846. And Veronica McDarby, the so-called lay sister, volunteered to come to Pittsburgh to devote herself to the household duties in the first Mercy convent in America. These were the ideal Sisters of Mercy. They were cultured, highly educated, witty, and all from good Irish families with deep connections to cardinals. I know. Sister Elizabeth Strange, this is a drawing of what she looked like, kept a diary to record the experiences aboard the Queen of the West. She reported that instead of coifs and veils, headdress, the sisters wore caps, and they, as best they could, kept to themselves. They altered their habits to not call attention to themselves as nuns fearful of Protestant hostile reactions. By the 2nd day of the voyage, they all succumbed to seasickness, some suffering from the more severe cases than others. Strange's sister, Sister Aloysia, she was ill for most of the journey. She died shortly after arriving in Pennsylvania. Not right away, but soon. On November 10, Strange reported all still ill, particularly Reverend Mother, Sister Aloysia, and the lay sisters. Sisters Josephine and Elizabeth, the only ones able to appear to table. Still, we contrived to talk a good deal of poor St. Leo's, that's their convent in Carlo, walk the decks as much as our illness would permit, and were cheered by the glimpse of the Irish coast. Sister Elizabeth, not being able to eat anything at dinner, was advised by the bishop to take meat and refused. I think it's important to note the congregation identifies Sister Elizabeth Strange as the author of the diary. She's referring to herself in the 3rd person. This is a typical way of writing in the convent chronicles, the records of their ministry. The diary isn't long. It's a mere 6 handwritten pages, but it often, as in this passage, puts to paper the longing the sisters had for their community back home in St. Louis. She mentions it regularly. And there is communication that goes back and forth between the Pittsburgh community and St. Louis so often. But they set sail for America, not knowing when they or if they will return to Ireland, and many did not. The spiritual connection to the Irish community ran deep. Frances Warde had joined Catherine Macaulay's charitable work at 17. in Dublin in 1827, prior to the establishment of the community altogether in 31. Afterwards, Warde became the first woman to profess her solemn vows as a Sister of Mercy. At 27, she was a superior of Carlow community. At 39, she was leading this group of young women across the Atlantic. By this point, Mother Macaulay had passed away, had died in 1841. When we think of Warde and others, we often see them in their later lives after the success of all their missions. And I think this is the common image I have of Mother Warde in my head. And she was a young woman. I forget that often. And so they get to New York, and then they travel to Philadelphia. They stop for several days with the Sisters of Charity there. And then they head off over the Alleghenies to Pittsburgh. And there's an account of them. They're afraid of falling down a ravine. It's a very arduous journey. They're afraid of bandits, but they make it nonetheless. The sisters don't arrive to a wilderness or a frontier outpost. Pittsburgh was, by this point, over 20,000 people. And there's industry already growing. A good portion of the people there were Irish. The sisters stepped into the work, establishing schools, visiting the sick, instructing children and adults in their Catholic faith. And their ranks were replenished by other sisters coming from Ireland, as well as newer entrants who were born in North America, or born in the community. You know, contemporary sisters today might say they were accompanying the people in the 19th century who they served, walking alongside them, their sisters and brothers. How is this different than what they did in Carlow? I don't have good answers for this. I'm trying to find them out. I'm learning as I go. But my previous research into the Chicago Foundation indicates the time in America and their parish schools and academies and hospitals and orphanages and all their ministries. And they built those, they took permanent root in the United States, and they stayed. This changed their perspective of their world. This is this is not Margaret O'Brien. This is what her community thinks she looks like. So this painting was done in the 20th century. There's no images of her available or that survived. Margaret O'Brien was 16 when she entered religious life in Carlow. At 24, she was superior of this new foundation in Chicago. Not 10 years later, she had died one day after entering a cholera ward in Chicago in July 1854. Very few records remain of her, and we don't know a lot about her. When she left Ireland for Pittsburgh, she never returned. When she left her Pittsburgh community for Chicago, she was able to maintain connections with, her former Mother Superior in that Pittsburgh community. In Chicago, the Mercies built institutions literally out of the mud of the early Chicago streets and served a largely Irish Catholic population amidst a predominantly Protestant city. The little we do know about O'Brien is that she felt strongly about a free Ireland, free of British and Protestant control. Early correspondence to Strange, this Mother Strange in Pittsburgh, suggests she did not trust, but found she had to work with Protestants who sent their daughters to their academy school. And they also provided financial support. Mother Agatha, writing to Sister Elizabeth Strange in Pittsburgh, remarked, it is not hard, dear sister, to deal with the worldlings. See how observant they are, how easily disedified. The Lord preserve us from them. Here I am, often afraid I have so much to do with Protestants. They visit us constantly, and we have some very warm friends amongst them, besides almost all the children in the select school are Protestants. She had come to learn she had to work with Protestant neighbors, yet she also expressed anger in a letter to her brother who had to leave Ireland for Australia about the manner in which the Irish were forced to leave their homeland to find economic security. For O'Brien, she followed where God called her. Her vows, her commitment to the religious life meant she willingly put her life at risk, which she did when she walks into a cholera ward. 4 years before her own death, Mother Agatha was writing her sisters at their Galena convent in Illinois, reported on a dying member of one of their community. While her letter meant to encourage and provide consolation to the sisters hundreds of miles away, Mother Agatha stressed the high purpose and reward of uniting with God. Our dear sister Josephine is very ill, hurrying into eternity. On Sunday, she made her solemn profession. Since then, she seems better than she was previous to the ceremony. Now she is clothed and fully prepared, I trust, for the kingdom of heaven. This is the reward which promised to those who leave all for God's sake. And this is the recompense we may hope to receive if we are faithful to our holy calling. So she took her at her deathbed, she took her vows and being clothed in her habit. So this was perfection. So we are familiar with this type of language and the desire to enter the realm of bliss, united with God forever. This is the language of zealous missionary, certain in her purpose. It's compelling. It's what makes the 19th century a delight to study. From our vantage point, we also want more. What did Mother Agatha really think about the sisters in her community who died, or of her Protestant neighbors? For what that matter, knowing as she did of the anti-Catholic sentiment that persisted throughout her new home. The lack of sources prevent us from drawing conclusions about what was in Mother Agatha's heart of hearts. Or can we? Can we take Agatha O'Brien at her word? This is what I want to find out. Okay, next phase. So I'll now shift gears and talk about Peru a little bit. I must say I am not a Latin American historian. I have never studied Spanish, and I'm learning as I go about the history of Peru. So forgive me for all the mistakes I'm going to make. In some ways, it's more compelling to study the 19th century, sure, despite the challenges of the incomplete or non-existent sources. What surprises lay there? Studying the religious life in the 20th century offers its own challenges and rewards, even with more sources. So in December 2008, I interviewed Sister Pat Murphy about her experience in Peru in the 1960s. She was part of the group that went to Chicago in '61 to establish a school and conduct a hospital in Sicuani. Over the course of our conversation, Sister Pat, known then as Sister Nivard, at the time of the mission, she told me that she was an eager volunteer to go to Peru. She was just a young sister, newish to the community, despite having little to no Spanish. Her recollections, 47 years after she arrived in Peru, are filtered through subsequent years' experience in social justice ministry, her embrace of Vatican II renewal, and her anger at and critique of the role of the United States in Latin America. She told me they were unprepared for this mission. She left Peru and questioned her vocation, but was called by the works of mercy and the Gospel of Matthew. So this is the passage that she spoke about when we talked. And so this is classic, sisters of mercy sort of attitude about who they serve and how and why. Sister Pat chose to remain a sister of mercy when many were leaving at that point in the 60s and 70s. Yet the missionary experience moved Sister Pat and others in new directions, and they adapted their religious lives. How they changed and what caused this shift in attitude and religious life are questions I wish to answer. Was the experience of the Sicuani mission wholly different from the first sisters who left Ireland for Pittsburgh and Chicago and beyond? Sister Pat is here. I think that's her too. The journey from Chicago to Peru took a couple days as they flew first to Florida, then to Lima. After several weeks of preparation and study and some sightseeing, this group flew to Arequipa. They leave here and they go from there. They take a train to Sicuani. They finally arrived at their destination and Chektoak. I can't pronounce these things. I'm sorry. I'm trying. I'm learning. 7 miles from Sicuani. Here was to be their base of operations. The accounts of the trip from Lima rival any journeying out story that Sister Elizabeth Strange might tell. Sister Lauren Rogers, for example, was concussed by ill-secured luggage and was assisted by 2 Scottish men and a doctor who just may have been a Seventh-day Adventist. Right. The advantage of time and distance, as we all know, help us understand the past and perhaps find meaning in it. In 2008, Sister Pat had gained new perspectives on her time in Sicuani. It is evident by the 1980s she had come to understand the Mercy's presence in Sicuani differently than she did in 1961. In '83, the Chicago Province Internal Publications Dimensions ran an article by Sister Karen Donahue, Return to Sicuani, Reflections on a 20th Century Crusade. The article featured Sister Pat, who had returned to Sicuani earlier that year in July. Lack of preparation and a certain naive zeal of evangelization dominate the characterization of the sisters who arrived in Peru. This 1983 account is full of thoughtful reflection about the purpose of the mission, any mission, becoming aware of paternalism inherent in their own actions, the evil of colonialism, and how their formation in the US obscured what were the, quote, social, economic, and spiritual needs of the Sicuani people. Sister Pat believed in 1961 that she came to Peru to bring Catholicism to the people. They were to give material and spiritual aid, but in doing so, they assumed power roles. They had no understanding of the political and economic forces at work in the 1960s. And in 1983, she reflected, when we went to Sicuani, we were very task-oriented. We started a school and took over a hospital. We gave little thought to the sign value of what we were doing. While we certainly thought we were conveying the love of Christ by our actions, our own cultural biases blinded us to the reality that the people perceive our endeavors as gringo, USA, materialism. We were looking through a different cultural filter. So in 2008 and in 1983, Sister Pat and others could articulate what they came to learn about their role in Catholic missions in Latin America. By 1983, according to Donahue's article, missionaries learned to be, quote, a peer servant, one who accompanies the people in their struggle, end quote. That fits very well with their language coming out of the 1970s and 80s about how they see their ministries. What about in 1969, when the mission ended? How did they understand their role then? Sister Mary Benedicta McCrory, who acted as the provincial liaison to Sicuani and who spent some time there, recorded the concerns of those involved in the mission at a January 23rd, 1969 meeting with Mother Mary Paulita Morris. She was the provincial head of the provincial government. Sister Mary Benedicta's sketchy notes record the frustration about the situation in Sicuani and the apparent failure of the Sisters of Mercy's mission there. Not the least of their questions were what to do next. Should they stay or go? Should they go for a while and then come back? Should they engage in experimental community living? And would they be allowed, apparently the bishop was against it, to come back? They wanted to, or to do the experimental community living. Sisters Benedicta's notes include frustrations such as Bishop Nevin Hayes is impossible. Kind of was. And the departure from the priesthood of one of the community leaders had shaken them. You can kind of see it's shaken them. On the next line of this entry, Sister Benedicta reported that Sister Mary Nivard's remarks, maybe we should not be there, and that she questioned our role. How did they get to this point? It was not as if they had a clear sailing from the start of their time in Peru. From the beginning of the mission, the Sisters of Mercy struggled learning languages. It was a Peruvian government bureaucracy to navigate. They had to build the school and the state of the hospital, supplies and personnel when they took it on in 1962 was a daily challenge. Letters home to Chicago in the first years, the correspondence was regular and in some case quite detailed. They even had a ham radio they could communicate with Chicago. Continually remark on the mud, the cold, and that their Jeep broke down regularly. In March 1961, Sister Mary Jonetta Keeney wrote Mother Mary Huberta McCarthy from Lima just days before leaving for their final destination near Sicuani, giving her a full account of all the small and large details about the trip to come and the logistics of their future school and hospital work. Things changed or evolved quickly. They believed that the school would be in Chektuak, but now it was going to be in Sicuani, and the bishop had made that decision without consulting them. Then there was the combination of 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades into one classroom. The crates of the materials they had sent ahead still had not arrived. The water pipes did not work, and they did not have electricity. Despite these problems, big and small, Sister Jonetta instructed Mother Huberta not to worry. Remember that we are the Peru pioneers. Just think about those 5 Sisters of Mercy who landed in Chicago and had nothing. Then just look around and see our wonderful province of so many sisters and 75 houses. Our dear Lord will bless this undertaking just as he blessed that on all these years. We are our 75th house, right? A diamond in the rough, eh? So reading this, this passage from 61 compels me to think, okay, to figure out my purpose is to figure out what was different about the missionary experience of the 1960s versus that of the 1840s. And here they're hearkening back to those original sisters. My initial thinking is that the Mercies who came in the 19th century came and walked alongside Catholic immigrants in places like Chicago and a hostile Protestant America, established a church and all its glorious infrastructure, and onward goes the Whiggish American Catholic history. Wrapped up in this is what we do not know about these first Sisters of Mercy who established these foundations and long ago in the growth of the Mercy Foundation, right? The Mercies who went to Peru, I initially speculate, went wrapped up in the zeal of the missionary experience, but with the practicality of the mid-20th century American formation. They had running water, electricity, penicillin that was not expired were a must, as was the important task of correcting ignorant, quote unquote, ignorant native populations' devotional practices and insistence that the prospective students had to be products of solemnized unions. They had to be married. They wouldn't take illegitimate children. They did make do with what they had, or they had to have, their parents had to have a Catholic marriage. They did make do with what they had, including making their own outhouses out of the packing crates, because the first school building did not have a bathroom, and there was delays in converting an outbuilding into a laboratory. So the structural problems faced by the Mercies in Peru were one thing, but they were not in Sicuani only to provide education and run a hospital. They came to Peru to revitalize the religious faith as well. Sister Jonetta, one of the two nurses and selected to direct the hospital work, wrote Mother Huberta a letter in later March 25th, 1962, about the state of the patient care, the work schedule, and their relationship with the medical staff, which wasn't always positive. Wanting to assure Mother Huberta that they were doing well, she wrote, "Mother, we are all holding our own and not overdoing. Honestly, the hardest part is trying to be patient with these poor people and to remember that they aren't doing the awful things they are through spite or anything like that, but just because they haven't had the spiritual and educational opportunities that we have had. The help on the whole have been quite cooperative, and I really feel sorry for them." So the Sisters of Mercy who responded to this call to go from the Vatican to go to Latin America did so enthusiastically. So when Bishop Hayes made the request to the Generalate of the Mercies, Regina Cunningham, for Mercies to come to Sicuani to provide education and healthcare, they went. These new dioceses were going to be largely Quechuans or native indigenous people. Mother Regina asked Mother Huberta to direct the mission and to provide help and support with the other superiors. As a part of the larger movement to provide priests, religious, and lay missionaries to Latin America, they joined women religious who found new opportunities to serve. On the cusp of change coming to religious life following sister formation, it's an education reform movement within the Catholic religious life, and the Vatican II renewal, here was a chance to serve the poor and serve the church. So it was clear in 61 and 62, very clear to them what they were there to do, whether they were right or wrong about it. And Sister Jonetta was not the only one to write to Chicago about the, quote, ignorance of the local people or express concern about the lack of proper, heavy air quotes, proper religious formation. In 1966, Sister William Mary Campbell, who did a lot of her ministry after this in Latin America, joined the mission a couple years after its founding. She wrote a long letter to Sister Benedicta in Chicago and reflected on their work. A new sister had just joined the group, Sister Mary Antonella Ortman, and she was articulating a bunch of questions that she's now Betty Campbell, Sister William Mary had been asking all along. Believing she did not have the correct and up-to-date language to convey her ideas, Sister William Mary, wrote about her experiences and the conclusions she drew from them. Pained and saddened by the level of poverty, the lack of education, infrastructure, and sufficient health care, she was frustrated by the language barrier. Sister William Mary, however, was, quote, just beginning to learn what it means to love in the community of mercy and the community of the people of God. She continued, our community is a tremendous part of the mystical body of Christ. We have the visibility in the world. Now we have taken on another part of the work of the church in Latin America to go into different culture, like a different world in its beliefs and customs, communicate in a different language, take study, analysis of the continuing kind, preparation, much love and humility on the part of all. It is the incarnation of Christ, and the missionaries must have or must desire to have his mind when they volunteer. They must come to live as he did, to suffer and die as he. She continued, the missionary must want to become a part of a new community, must give their all. They must have preparation, must know the aims of the mission, and must have the freedom to function within the mission, which means communication, which means courage of them, zeal, prudence, patience, love, convictions, and many things. Sister William Mary continued over the next 2 pages, typed, she had a lot to say, to lay out the need for better organization, communications among the sisters and priests, and most important, the need for more resources. When the Sisters of Mercy sent people and the resources to Latin America in 1961, they joined a larger missionary movement of the 20th century to revitalize the Catholic Church and to combat the spread of communism. In the post-World War II period, Peru needed priests and religious and the Vatican's call for European and North American Catholics to tend to their brothers and sisters was answered. The US government and the Catholic Church had a joint purpose in preventing communism's growth in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 underscored this concern. The likes of Pope Pius XII and John XXIII called for Catholics in Europe and North America to recognize Latin American Catholics were all part of the mystical body of Christ, and they take greater responsibility for them. And American church leaders like Cardinal Richard Cushing of Boston championed these ideas. Romulo Carboni, the papal nuncio in Peru, campaigned for the US congregation's assistance at the time. Foreign priests and women religious were deployed in rural and remote areas unserved by the Peruvian clergy and religious. And the newly established prelature of Sicuani, led by the equally newly appointed Bishop Nevin Hayes, was one such place. They wanted they wanted the North American and European style Catholicism to be transported to Peru. To Latin America. That's what they wanted. Yes, the Mercies in Peru intended to revitalize and modernize the Catholicism there. They responded to alleviate the suffering of poverty through education and healthcare, but also catechesis, education in their faith. In practice, this appeared very much like a call to transplant a type of European American Catholicism to Peru. And this is how they understood their purpose initially. While they spent their first weeks in Lima gathering supplies, filling paperwork, attempting to learn Spanish, and touring local sites with their hosts, the Immaculate Heart of Mary Sisters, their letters home to Chicago included observations of the convoluted government bureaucracy, the perceived slow pace everything happened, whether shipments of supplies arrived safely, the construction and renovation of their school, the disparity of society, injustice to the lives of the very poor, and the ignorance of the people they came to serve. Yet letters home conveyed their assurances in the rightness of the sisters' mission. One circular letter, so they would write a letter home and it would get circulated to all the houses in the Union and everyone would read it. One circular letter in February of 1961, after a trip with the IHMs to Callao, 12 miles north of Lima, described a hacienda plantation with thousands of poor Indians worked like slaves. We should thank God that we as a community are among the ranks of the churches, missionaries laboring in Latin America. True, the problems existing are great, but it is no longer a question of just seeing and talking about these existing evils. Now, in the spirit of mercy, we are about to reach out, raise up, and help restore the faith that Latin America once knew in the living Christ. The need is Christ in truth and in all his fullness. So the same part of this letter, she talks about the fact that they were celebrating George Washington's birthday there, and they rejoiced in their father of our country. She sort of expressed a patriotism. She was grateful that she was American. She was blessed in that way. So there's a mixing of patriotism and so forth, and their commitment of their mission. Interesting, in 2008, Sister Pat expressed a different perspective of the United States, particularly her criticism of the US government. Okay, so why did they leave Sicuani? According to community history, they left because the church in Latin America was quote, undergoing a process of change and the missionaries were changing. Furthermore, the school that the Chicago province funded and built in '64 never had enough enrollment to support it. Concerns about retention are ongoing. There were also concerns about the stability of the Peruvian government following the 1968 overthrow of the president, Fernando Belaunde, by the General Juan Velasco Alvarado. By 1968, the continuation of the school was in jeopardy, and the real discussions were had with local religious and community leaders of giving it up, hoping either the government or another religious community would take it on. Contemplating the future of the school also meant identifying their goals. And so this is a document, this letter that Sister Nivard Pat wrote to the sisters. Here she talks about the various things they're reading, and they're very much influenced by liberation theology at this point, which is kind of radical for them to do that in '68. They're still in habit. They're still, they haven't gone to secular dress yet. They're still on the cusp of renewal, like in the throes of renewal, excuse me. Letters from June indicate the sisters were what they were reading, had weekly discussions on mission theology, which led to identifying the goal to help them to help themselves. Right. At this point of the project, I have more questions than I have answers. At times, the letters and the minutes of the Sicuani missions at times are clear, and other times my untrained Americanist eyes, they're opaque. Was Bishop Hayes impossible? I think he was. Why were priests leaving? Was it necessary for the Sisters of Mercy to record everything they ate in letters to Chicago, or was it just to keep their correspondence lively? The biggest question is, of course, how did the missionary experience change them, right? How did it change religious life? How did they go from wanting to reach out, raise up, and help restore the faith that of Latin America to helping others help themselves? So I still have my questions. This is where I am. How are these missionaries different? How are they the same? How did the missionary experience change them? Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can, Okay. So do we have questions? We have time for some questions. Anybody have questions? If you have questions, just throw them in the chat for those of you on Zoom, and we'll read them out. But anyone here have questions? You gotta talk into the microphone.
Well, I just noticed in the last screen, there was a reference to radical statements by Ivan Illich. What was that? That sounds that sounds fascinating.
Can you go up to that slide? What about the one above 68? Yeah. So Illich was a priest at the time, and he was talking about, I don't know a lot of his stuff. I'm sort of studying this. But so it's the ICA. So the people were being trained as missionaries, and they're reading his writings. And so they're, these are people who are writing more honestly about what's going on in the church in Latin America and what's going on in Latin America, and the European or North American missionaries, what they were doing.
So that was part of liberation theology?
Getting into that, yeah. I'm still learning this. This is where I'm still finding things out. I've got a lot to learn. So, yeah. John, do you have?
Well, it was very similar. It was kind of asked, I was wanting to ask, can you describe the process by which they became much more radical, it appears, over the course of the 60s? Was this happening? It was, I'm presuming, everywhere in the church, but it clearly was happening in Peru as well to the sisters. And there's something else I was going to add to that. But I'll just stop there. I mean, so what was kind of I know what it was. And did this lead to kind of a change in their own, it sounds like a change in their own self-definition of their role? Was it away from catechesis and religious education and much greater emphasis on social justice?
Yeah. So there's two things happening at the same time. In the US, the sisters are going through, they're going through sister formation movement coming out of the 50s, where they said, we need to be fully educated before we step into our ministries. And so don't throw the 18-year-old or the 19-year-old novice into, or postulant or junior into a classroom of 50 kids. Same thing with whatever position they were. And so then by the 60s, with the call to renew religious life, the Sisters of Mercy in particular are going through a lot of internal reflection and conversation and dialogue. And so I studied more specifically the Chicago Mercies. And so they were meeting throughout, by 66, 67, 68, they started thinking about how they're going to experiment in their community life. Considered people were getting advanced degrees, that sort of thing. So for the sisters in Peru, they're knowing about all this. They're getting all this news. They're going back and forth. They go to Lima periodically. But they're also they're seeing things firsthand. They said, Sister Pat told me that they are already Catholic. They don't need another school. They don't need that. They need something else. And there is a degree of, it's just a different, she comes to understand this. And I think this is, others would say the same, that they have to get out of the way of their agenda, what the bishop wants, what the church, the clergy want. They have to, how can they really help the people they're with? And so that changes them. Plus there's a lot of, which is I'm still learning about, there's a lot of like political upheaval and some violence, and there's some throughout Peru, there's things happening.
So were the bishops resistant to these changes? Were they resistant to liberation theology?
Yeah, Bishop Hayes was against any kind of experimentation. He had he was an American. He's from the Chicago area, I think. But he had a particular mindset about what he expected for these sisters. He wanted them, not the sisters who've been in Peru all this time either. So, other questions? Okay. So the first one, go to the top. Did you read in letters how Peruvian people responded to Sisters of Mercy in Peru in the long run? I'm not sure what that question is asking. Did read in letters how Peruvian people responded to Mercy? Yeah, okay, I think I understand. Yeah, people liked them. People would welcome them. They had some conflict. I'm still doing the research, so I don't have all the sources that at my disposal. I haven't processed all my research yet. They had some. I think the biggest problem they had was with city officials, Sicuani officials, government. Yeah. So I hope that answers. So do you have much information on where the well-educated Irish sisters were educated? Presumably this factor is attracting the Protestant pupils to their academies. To the first question, no, I don't know that. So I'm still learning this part. I deeper dive into the Carlo area. I'm really curious about what Carlo was like particularly. But in the US, the Mercies weren't always known for their academy schools. There were others, the fine finishing schools. They would learn, provide French and embroidery and English literature and all those things. But they were in that particular moment in Chicago, they offered a type of education that was not prevalent in all places. As opposed to just send them back east, their daughters back east or in other places. So these types of academy schools were very popular for elite Protestants. How much their cultural bias affect their work in Peru? A lot. I mean, it did affect them a great deal. They saw the world from their, North American, Chicago-based, perspective. Yes. Hi, Christine. What do you think motivated the sisters' celebration of Washington's birthday? Homesickness? I may have missed it, but were the Peruvians expected to participate? No, this was something that was strictly I think the IHMs were part of this, but it was the Chicago, the part of the Sisters of Mercies. I think it's homesickness. That's my guess. I hope that answers. Thanks, Mary. Okay. Any other questions? Questions? I can't see. Uh-oh.
This is a leading question.
Oh, no.
Oh, there's one that's just come up, but I don't know if you talked with Janish about this, but you talk about processing your research. Could you talk a little bit more about the diary, or I forget what it's technically called?
Yeah.
The process of finding it, because I know you went to North Carolina.
Yeah.
You know, talk about that whole process.
Okay. So when I first started doing research for the Mercies, I was contracted by the Chicago community. And so I would go up to Chicago, do my research in their archives. I got to go into archival records that nobody got to go into because I was hired by them. So I got to see administrative records, government stuff. But after the Mercies did some more merging, they centralized their archives in North Carolina and Belmont. And so I went down there about, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, for one trip, and I started this research. And then last summer, thank you, History, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Department, for funding my little research trip to North Carolina. I was there about a week, and I went into the archives, and I brought my camera and my phone and my notebook and my computer, and I just took lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of photographs, thousands of photographs, because this is in the old days, we'd have to have make photocopies of things, right? And so having to go through and process all that paperwork, all the files, and some of it's in Spanish, and I don't read Spanish. Anybody have a volunteer who wants to translate my documents for me? I'd be grateful. So that's the process. I go and it's the documents like the diary I showed a picture of that you gotta love, right? Letters that express personal opinions and feelings, you gotta love those. But most of them are just really boring minute records.
And how large are they?
What do you mean by large? You gotta stay back. You gotta go back. Yeah. What was it again? How large are the records?
How big is that mission diary?
Some of them are, you're talking about actually physical size. They're not very thick. They're not very big. Some of them are not. I did take photographs of their entire Pittsburgh entrance book, which is huge and it's really well documented. Some more questions. Kenny, is there reference to the 1968 amendment? Yes. I do. I will come across that. I know I have come across that, the Mendeline conference, but I haven't gotten to that part of my research yet. Yes. There are, and also the second part, Kenny, do you mean Protestants or other Catholic communities?
No, it's actually other Catholic that in the absence of priests, they oftentimes converted to what they call Christian-based communities, which are really grassroots-based churches, especially in rural areas. And I know that I see it in Central America, in areas that have been influenced by liberation theology, but I didn't know if it had existed in the highlands of Peru. I have not I don't think so, or I haven't come across it yet when I'm the 61 to 69. But I have found, so like Sister Betty Campbell goes on to Honduras after this. And so she's there through the 70s and 80s. And she talks about that. She's had experience. Her letters talk about that experience. And she did find it very rewarding. This is one of the reasons why I think she stayed. So yes. This is a great project because of, I know the Chicago aspect is interesting, but for Peru, it's really interesting just because of all the change that takes place in the 60s, especially in the highlands, where you had like formations of guerrilla groups in the early 60s. And by 68, you have a military coup that's a leftist military government that assumes control over a lot of the projects that the missions might have had control over. And so it could have been really problematic for the sisters at the mission once the military dictatorship takes control.
The Mercy Union sent another like the Burlingame Mercies sent a separate mission to Peru about 64, I think, and they stayed the whole time. They never left. They were, I think, in Punt. They're a little bit west and north of Sicuani. And they stayed through all of it. And I think they still are there. I think. Like, I'm not 100% certain of that. So, yeah, but the Mercies went on to, from this point, to establish missions in Argentina, no, Chile, as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your research. This is fascinating.
Well, I hoped I get to finish it. This is why my grading isn't done, people. Other questions?
When you were talking about your approach to the project, you said you're looking for the similarities and differences between their experience of coming to the States and then their experience of going to Peru.
Yeah.
Now, a lot happened between those two events chronologically. For instance, when they came to the United States, there weren't that many Catholics, and they were very Irish in their Catholicism, but then there was a huge influx of Catholic Slavic peoples, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, and Italians. And how did they, are you going to look at how they dealt with the cultural differences there to compare with how they dealt with the cultural differences in Peru? Because they were substantial and there was a lot of friction.
Yeah, I mean, yes. My study, I don't know if I'm going to go that deep into the later 19th century. I mean, the American church becomes the Irish Catholic, Irish American, German American church. And the Irish, particularly the Irish clergy, treat other Catholic groups as beneath them, and ignorant, and forgetting their own, ignorant folk ways. But so, yes, to a certain extent. My getting at this is I think I use the phrase, the Whiggish American Catholic history, that they came, they progressed, they succeeded, church triumphant by the 20th century. And they stayed, and I get the sense with the Peruvian the sisters who go to Peru, they're not going to stay. They don't see that their intent is to go stay. They're going to rescue, right? And I want to see, what did the sisters who came in the 1840s think about what they were doing? Was it merely because it's hard to get a boat back, right? Or is it, how is their attitude different? Or how do we see it differently? We see it as like, this is a done deal. This is a success story. Yay, American Catholic Church. But I want to compare. I was speaking with longtime mentor, Sister Dolores Liptak, about this. And she's a Mercy, and she said to me that we were always missionaries first. When the original group came, and so we forget that. I think that's something I want to explore, and I haven't really done a lot. I have not done a lot of looking into Pittsburgh yet, and I didn't think I was going to until I got to the archives. This is a nice, fun archival thing. Once I got there and I started trying to learn a little bit more about those sisters, like, oh, there's a whole stuff I need to think about Pittsburgh, and what that means. And so I don't know what this project is going to end up being. It's still evolving.
If I can follow up, you said that the mission to Peru was really at the sort of the idea came from the bishop, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who asked
For the Pope.
From the Pope. Now, when they came to the States, was that something they themselves decided to do, or was it similar where the church hierarchy sent them?
Well, in this case, so the new Bishop Michael O'Connor, he needed resources. And so the clergy in the US and to a certain extent probably in Ireland and the Vatican, they knew that this beginning of this migration of Catholics, they needed the people to build the church, right. And particularly in a hostile Protestant land.
Yeah, my question was simply, maybe initially they came to the States because it was something that they wanted to do, was their idea.
Well, they would never originate. The sisters who came, the 7 sisters who came, it wasn't their idea necessarily, but they had to volunteer, and there were some people who were picked, sure, but you had to be willing to go, and that's a huge deal because, 16 years old. How do you know what you want to do when you're 16 years old, she volunteers to go, and they let her go. And she never sees her family again. So I think that's significant and meaningful. Yes.
One last question.
Is there affiliation of Sisters of Mercy that with particular parishes in both US and Peru, Chicago versus Sicuani, or a more rural city? Yes, there's a Mother Xavier Ward building, Old St. Pat's in Chicago. Yeah, Mother Xavier, Frances Xavier Ward in particular, she's the main person who drives or plants all these new foundations. And so you will see in various mercies, so there's a St. Francis Xavier Academy, right? St. St. Xavier University is that comes from that name. And so, yeah, that's that planting of that name. And there's a Carlo College in Pittsburgh, right? So that's where the Mercies planted their university, their college. Mother Macaulay High School in Chicago, that used to be St. Xavier Academy, but in about the 50s, Catholic Academy high schools started changing their names to their founders. So that's why there's a bunch of Brother Rices around the country. So, yeah. So I think we've got it. As long as there's no other questions, I think we'll call it thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for those of you in Hammond. Thank you for those who are attending through Zoom. I'm grateful that you all were here today.